In the summer of 1940, as the United States Army was scrambling to prepare for the war that they knew was coming, a new kind of soldier was training with a new way of entering combat, the paratrooper. The Army started with a parachute test platoon, which developed a course of instruction while training themselves in how to jump out of perfectly good airplanes. The course is basically the same today. They started by leaping from aircraft mock-ups. Then they progressed to making jumps from towers. Finally, they parachuted out of real airplanes. Most of these paratroopers in training had never flown in an aircraft before, much less jumped out of one. Some said that the experience was so overwhelming that you couldn't think of anything else as you prepared to jump. On a bet to prove he was thinking clearly, one soldier yelled, "Geronimo," and gave a war whoop as he left the plane. Well, as they say, if it ain't true, it ought to be. Geronimo has been the catchword for parachutists ever since. The airborne expanded rapidly. By 1941, the Army was forming separate parachute battalions. The 4th Battalion formed was activated on October 5, 1941, as the 504th Parachute Infantry Battalion. As fate would have it, the 504th was chosen to be the first battalion of paratroopers to deploy to England. Redesignated the 2nd Battalion of the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment, they chose the nickname Geronimos. Under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Edson Rafe, the Geronimos trained with British Airborne during the summer of 1942. Rafe was a force to be reckoned with and pushed the battalion hard. It was Rafe who said, "In military operations, in general, the boldest plan is the best." Rafe's philosophy and the paratroopers' hard work paid off. On November 8, 1942, as part of Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, the Geronimos flew 1,500 miles from England to Algeria and made the first combat jump in American airborne history. They had no references to guide them in their planning. In this operation, the 2nd of the 503rd, later to be designated the 509th Parachute Infantry Battalion, wrote the first principles of airborne doctrine for later units to build upon. The Geronimos added to their success when just a week later they jumped on an airstrip near Uclibon, Algeria, on November 15, 1942. The field was near the border with Tunisia, at that time occupied by the German Army. They jumped just minutes before German paratroopers arrived. It seems the Nazis wanted the airfield too, but the arrival of Americans convinced them to turn around. For the next 2 months, while the American Army organized in Algeria, their eastern flank was screened by the Tunisian Task Force, consisting of a unit of tank destroyers and 509th paratroopers under the command of Colonel Edson Rafe. The 509th would stay an independent unit throughout the remainder of the war. Despite being a bastard battalion without the support of a regimental or division headquarters, the jump into North Africa was only the first of a long list of firsts. The story of this often overlooked unit is chronicled in the book, The Boldest Plan is Best, the combat history of the 509th Parachute Infantry Battalion during World War II by Jim Broumley. The Geronimos were held in strategic reserve for Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. They moved from Tunisia to Lycata, Sicily on September 5, 1943. 4 days later, General Mark Clark's 5th Army landed at Salerno, Italy. The Allies established a beachhead at Salerno, but their hold was tenuous. By September 13th, Clark called for his airborne reserves. The 504th and 505th Parachute Infantry Regiments of the 82nd Airborne Division jumped inside the beachhead to strengthen the Allied line. The Geronimos, however, were given a much more challenging assignment. Midday on September 14th, the 509th Parachute Infantry Battalion, now under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Doyle Yardley, was given the mission to jump that same night into a drop zone near the mountain town of Avellino. Their mission was to take a crossroads at Avellino and block the enemy from moving supplies and reinforcements to the Allied beachhead. The Geronimos were ordered to hold the crossroads for 3 to 5 days until relief forces arrived from Salerno. They would be on their own for days, 20 miles behind enemy lines. Some considered it a suicide mission. The jump did not go well. For various reasons, pilots became disoriented and aircraft scattered, dropping the Geronimos over a 100-square-mile area. Some were as far away as 40 miles from the intended drop zone. Out of the over 600 paratroopers who took off from Sicily, only about 100 were able to gather in the drop zone, not enough to complete their primary mission. But there was a secondary mission for the 509th. It had been impressed upon every soldier in the unit the necessity of doing everything in their power to disrupt the flow of German units to the beachhead. And they did. Imagine the Germans having to deal with over 500 motivated American paratroopers scattered in their rear area. The Geronimos fought individually and in small groups. They assaulted small enemy detachments, they were ambushing convoys, and cutting communications. Having a mass drop within their lines kept the Germans on alert and devoting resources to searching for hidden parachutists. The Allies prevailed at Salerno, and over the following 2 weeks, paratroopers of the 509th filtered back into friendly lines. The battalion's after-action report estimates that the Geronimos killed or wounded approximately 250 German soldiers during the Avellino jump. Out of the 641 Geronimos who jumped, 115 were killed, captured, or listed as missing. This number includes their battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Yardley, who was wounded and taken prisoner by the Germans. Lieutenant Colonel William Yarborough took command of the Geronimos as the battalion reorganized and received replacements. They were stationed in Naples and were chosen as the honor guard to 5th Army headquarters. Despite their jump wings and parachute patch on their overseas caps, the paratroopers didn't want to be confused with any of the rear echelon Army headquarters types. With unit morale in mind, Yarborough had a unit patch designed for the men to wear on the left chest of their uniform jackets. The patch depicted a Native American stick figure poised to jump from an aircraft. It had 509 arched over the top and the word Geronimo underneath. The men said the figure looked like a gingerbread man, but they liked it, and the figure was later incorporated into their unit crest. However, because of the patch, the paratroopers of the 509th had a new nickname, the Gingerbread Men. By early November 1943, the Germans had been pushed back to a defensive line across the middle of Italy. The frontline divisions of the 5th Army were exhausted after 6 weeks of fighting. General Mark Clark attempted to break the stalemate by committing his special reserves to the mountain fighting. That meant sending the 504th Parachute Infantry, Darby's Rangers, and the 509th Parachute Infantry Battalion to fight as regular infantry. On November 9, 1943, the Gingerbread Men climbed aboard trucks instead of airplanes. They held a portion of the Allied line near the town of Venafro. The hills and mountains were so steep that the men used mules to haul supplies up and their wounded comrades back down. The battalion was attached to the Rangers and under the command of Colonel William Darby. The battalion's surgeon, Captain Carlos Doc Alden, figured it was 3.5 to 4 miles up the mountains where the men were fighting and his aid station down in Venafro. So he put some grenades in his pocket, grabbed his Thompson submachine gun, and headed up the mountain. He believed he and his medics had to be there to catch them as they fall. The Geronimos conducted an attack on their first day, then defended against counterattacks. They were subjected to sniper fire and enemy artillery for the next 34 days before being relieved to return to Naples and prepare for their next operation. Replacements were already waiting for the Geronimos when they arrived in Naples. Within days, they were training to make a beach landing. To break the stalemate in Italy, the Allies planned Operation Shingle, an end run about 50 miles up the coast to the resort town of Anzio. A beachhead here would allow follow-on forces to either threaten the rear of the Germans' defensive line or move on Rome, just 30 miles away. The 509th PIB was once again attached to Darby's Rangers. Once they hit the beach, the Gingerbread Men were ordered to turn east and clear the small town of Nettuno, 2 miles away, before moving out to establish their part of the beachhead. On January 22, 1944, the U.S. 6th Corps landed almost unopposed. Famously and unfortunately, the 6th Corps did not move off the beach quickly enough. Although the enemy was taken by surprise, the Germans reacted quickly and within days had 2 divisions on the high ground overlooking the Allied beachhead. The Geronimos endured 73 days of combat at Anzio. The battalion earned a Presidential Unit Citation for holding the line against a massive German attack on their position. Additionally, one Gingerbread Man, Corporal Paul Huff, was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his actions at Anzio. They had hit the beach with 680 paratroopers, but when they left on April 1st to prepare for their next operation, they only had about 125 men who were either not killed, wounded, or missing in action. The Geronimos arrived back in Naples on April 2nd. They received replacements, moved veterans to fill vacant leadership positions, and started training again. They made their first training jump on May 15th, hoping that they'd jump into combat next time. The stalemate in Italy lasted until late May. The Allies broke out of the Anzio beachhead, and Rome fell on June 4th, 1944. 2 days later, the Geronimos heard the news that the Allies had landed at Normandy. Shortly after the Allies took Rome, the 509th Parachute Infantry Battalion was moved forward to be near airfields around the Italian capital. They began making practice jumps, and it became obvious to the men that they were training for another large operation. It was named Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France. The objectives were to open up the ports of Marseille and Toulon, push the Germans north, and then hook up with the Allied forces that were breaking out of the Normandy beachhead. For this operation, the 509th was part of the 1st Airborne Task Force, a collection of American and British airborne units. The Airborne Task Force was ordered to drop around the town of Lemoy, 15 miles inland. The terrain made the town a natural bottleneck, and holding it would block the Germans from rushing reinforcements to the beaches. In the early hours of August 15, 1944, the Gingerbread Men were among the first paratroopers to land in southern France. They had not jumped into combat since Avellino, but despite a morning fog, this jump went well. Over 75% of the unit hit their designated drop zone. Local civilians and French resistance provided valuable intelligence. The Geronimos made quick work of the enemy force remaining in Lemoy, then with the rest of the 1st Airborne Task Force, turned east and liberated Caen and Nice. The Germans conducted a fighting retreat with the airborne on their heels. As the Geronimos entered each town along the French Riviera, the liberated citizens would pour into the streets to greet the Americans with champagne and flowers. So the men dubbed the operation the Champagne Campaign. With the Riviera cleared of Germans, the 1st Airborne Task Force turned north to screen the right flank of 7th Army along the French Maritime Alps. The 509th would run combat patrols in the mountains until late November, when they were moved to Reims to sit in reserve. The war was going so well for the Allies that they settled into garrison life and started making big plans for celebrating Christmas. With the departure of Lieutenant Colonel Yarborough for a new assignment, Major Edmund Tomasic took command of the Geronimos. The battalion had settled into life near Paris, held as strategic reserve along with the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, when on December 16, 1944, 3 German armies came crashing through the Ardennes region of Belgium across the 60-mile front. All of the airborne reserves were sent north to stop the German Bulge in the Allied line. The Geronimos were attached to the 3rd Armored Division, which had been assigned to 18th Airborne Corps. The 509th arrived on the north side of the Bulge on December 22nd. Cold, confusion, and exhaustion were common experiences among soldiers who fought in the Battle of the Bulge. The Gingerbread Men were in combat under extreme winter conditions for 26 days. The battalion was awarded another Presidential Unit Citation for taking back the village of Zadzot after a surprise German push. The 509th had gone into the Battle of the Bulge with a full complement of 745 men. After their last attack, on the day they were relieved, the battalion's strength was down to 7 officers and 48 enlisted men. While fighting in the Bulge, the Geronimos didn't know that decisions were being made at the War Department and an airborne command that would affect the future of their unit. Back in 1941, after the Army had formed the first 4 parachute battalions, the decision was made to only activate new regiments. The Army would no longer support independent battalions. The Geronimos arrived at Troppont, Belgium on January 29th. On February 1, 1945, the men of the 509th Parachute Infantry Battalion were informed that their battalion was deactivated without ceremony. Those Geronimos available for duty would be transferred to other units for the remaining months of the war. The boldest plan is the best. That philosophy was demonstrated over and over again by the 509th Parachute Infantry Battalion on the battlefields of World War II. You can read the riveting true story of the first American paratroopers to jump into combat. Follow these same men as they parachute behind enemy lines in Italy, hold the line against a German onslaught at Anzio, and parachute into southern France to liberate Caen and Nice. Stay with them until their last fight during the Battle of the Bulge, where only 55 gingerbread men walked away. Little has been written about the gingerbread men in World War II, but the 509th Parachute Infantry Battalion's combat chronicle is now available in one source. In The Boldest Plan is the Best, author Jim Broumley has skillfully crafted a narrative on the beginnings of American airborne and the first paratroopers to enter combat. The exploits of this bastard battalion are brought to life with the voices of the veterans themselves, 70 photographs, and 17 original maps. Read this story of an often overlooked unit of elite American paratroopers. The Boldest Plan is the Best, the combat history of the 509th Parachute Infantry Battalion during World War II, is available on Amazon.com in paperback, Kindle, and on Kindle Unlimited.